So we're talking today about testing to learn. So we've already been introduced with Kristen and myself. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that all tests are risks. They might be really small risks, they may be very large risks. It all depends on what exactly you're testing. And there are some risks that are actually really good risks to take. Depends on what you're opening yourself up to by when you go ahead and actually run your test. So examples of bad risks are when you're going ahead and running your test, if it has a potential to detrimentally impact your list health. That's things like deceptive subject lines, making it so that your friendly from isn't clear on who you are, making it so that there's like a bait and switch. Things like that are things that could ultimately make it so that you end up with a huge amount of unsubscribes or a large amount of complaints that would impact your deliverability. You also don't want to do things that hurt your brand, so that's a lot of tests that are related to tone. If you have a brand like mine, which is Highmark Health is the largest Blue Cross Blue Shield provider in Western Pennsylvania, we have to have a very specific tone. We can't be flippant or anything like that because we are operating with health insurance and hospitals, and it's a very sort of business to business, or it's about people's health, so it's very serious. You also don't want to test anything that breaks laws. That seems like it's really self-explanatory, but you would be really surprised the number of people who want to test subjects that start with RE colon. That breaks can spam. You can't act like it's a reply to something.
And it's awful, don't do it.
Yes, it's awful because you're deceiving your customer, but because you're deceiving your customer, it's a deceptive subject line and breaks can spam, as well as other laws, presumably CASL and GDPR. The other thing, sometimes if you take a risk that could open you up to losing bunches of money, maybe don't do that. So it is actually somewhat easy to identify these things at times, which is think about what if your test goes wrong? What happens if things don't go the way that you think that they will? When you go ahead and test, you should have an actual hypothesis, like going back to 7th grade science. There should be a hypothesis of what you think is going to happen. You should have a control group. You should go ahead and actually run your test and then look at your results and figure out what's going to happen. When you go ahead and talk about good risks, these are things that maybe you'll learn about your audience, maybe you won't if the test doesn't work well, but that's why it's good to actually go ahead and test. Also running tests so that you can establish best practices for your brands, and having something that would have a neutral or positive impact. That is things like subject lines and stuff like that. It may come up so that it doesn't make a difference, but if you find things that your company actually likes and your users actually like, then it can go ahead and make this positive impact. The one that I hadn't touched on is increasing credibility, and that's where you actually talk about making it so you can get buy-in from management towards you as an email marketer. Not just testing, because in some cases it's with testing, but also just so that you can get the respect of your boss or further higher up or other departments. If you actually, whether they work or not, if you can say, we went ahead and took our audience and we split it this way because we wanted to see if this would happen. This is what the results are, and here are all of these numbers. That increases your credibility. It makes it so that you're not just some person who's a wizard and you make emails go out the door. It actually makes it so that you're establishing yourself as a marketer who actually knows what they're talking about, and that you are actually giving your entire marketing team insight into how your audience thinks, how you can go ahead and increase monetization. So eventually you'll get people coming to you saying, we have this audience and we want to be able to reach them more effectively. How do we do that? And they'll start asking you about tests that you could run to go ahead and do that. Once that starts happening, it makes it so that you can get more and more buy-in because people actually respect your opinion and know that it's coming from a place that's backed by data. So when you're going ahead and doing weighing your risks, it frequently comes up with what you are actually wanting to test. So that's what Kristen is going to go ahead and talk about.
Hey everyone. Yeah, so we all know that we should all be A/B testing. It's super important, but it's not always super clear what we should be testing or how to figure out what we should even be testing. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So the main thing to think about when you're designing your strategy for any kind of testing is, What do you want to know about your subscribers? It seems simple, and it is simple. What do you want to know? It's not just, oh, I'm going to test this thing because I know I should be testing, and I'm just testing for the sake of testing. That's pointless. Don't do it. Instead, think about like what your goal of your email you're sending is. So most of our ESPs, the way that they structure A/B testing and determine winners is really based on, okay, yeah, this one had the most opens or this one had the most clicks. But for most of the emails that you're sending, your goal probably isn't just getting opens and clicks, right? Your goal is conversions, whether you're selling something, trying to get someone to download a white paper, complete a survey, whatever you're asking them to do. That's what your actual goal of your email. So you should be looking at which version of the email made the person do the thing. You're not looking at which version made the email opens happen, which could be the thing you want to do, but really ultimately your goal of the email is to get conversions and make money. So which version made them do that? So you may have to dig a little bit deeper into whatever results you're seeing in your ESP. So you should be optimizing for the call to action rather than the open rate. So another thing that gets tricky with testing is sometimes your test has inconclusive results. So I saw this tweet last week from my friend Alessandra, who's somewhere around here today, and she ran a subject line test, and the open rate was exactly the same, and she's like, great, now what? Like, what's the point of this? I'm not learning anything. But the truth here is you actually are learning something. You're learning that the thing that you just tested doesn't matter with my audience. So that's good information to have, and that just tells you, okay, we should maybe test it again to just confirm that, or, okay, let's move on to something that actually matters. So I had a personal experience with this when I worked at Warby Parker a couple of years ago. We sent a post-purchase survey where if you completed the survey, you would be entered in a drawing for some free sunglasses, and we tested subject lines. The first one was just, got a minute, and that was very on brand for Warby. Like, their subject lines are really creative and quippy and cute, a little bit quirky. The other subject line was, complete our survey for a chance to win a free pair of sunglasses. So very different subject lines. We were testing to see if the sunglasses incentive made a difference, and we had the exact same open rate for both of those emails, which was really surprising for us. We're like, really? Like, they're so different. But what we did see is the click-through rate and the survey completion rate was phenomenally different for the version that mentioned the sunglasses in the subject line. Even though inside the email they were identical, both emails said, yeah, if you complete the survey, you'll be entered to win the sunglasses. But just mentioning it in the subject line made a difference. So one thing to think about here is, like, subject lines can affect other things besides open rate. So that's something to keep in mind when you're designing a test. So in my job, we recently, over the last 3 years, migrated all of the 109 Girl Scout councils to Salesforce Marketing Cloud. And my job was setting up their business units and creating their accounts and training them and teaching them how to be good email marketers, which was a very large task. They're all wonderful, and it went well, and we finished in August with the migration, so I'm very happy about that. I know I've talked about this the last couple of years, so we finished, yay. But as part of their training, I do a session on A/B testing, and part of it is how to use the A/B testing technology in our tool, but also how to develop a strategy. And a big part of my slides for that are using the scientific method that you learned in 7th grade, like have the hypothesis, have a method, think about what you want to do. But another thing that I drill home with them is the idea of testing concepts rather than content. So what I mean by that is a lot of people say, oh, I want to test subject lines, and then they write 2 subject lines that they like and test them and see which one does better. But that's not enough, because you're not going to be able to apply those results to a future email. So even if you have one subject line that does amazing and one that doesn't, you're probably not using that same subject line again. You may use a similar format, but you're not going to keep using it again. So instead, I suggest testing a concept. So maybe it is short subject lines versus long subject lines, or a promotion versus not a promotion, just something like that. Because that way you can tweak it to really hone in on what is right, but you can also apply the results of the test to a future send. And I think that's something a lot of marketers may be doing unconsciously or not, or they may just be writing 2 subject lines because their boss said they wanted to test subject lines and they did it and they had a winner, but then what? So yeah, I'm going to test subject lines. Not enough. You need a strategy. So like I said, we did our slides yesterday, so I forgot I got a little ahead of myself. But yeah, so by testing concepts, you give yourself opportunity to apply your results to future emails, which is really important, because if you're not doing that, then why are you even testing? Like, what's the point? So a couple of ideas for concepts that you could be testing. And again, this goes back to what do you want to learn about your subscribers? It's going to be different based on your business needs. But you could be testing with your messaging, funny versus serious, short versus long, having images versus text. I know earlier they were talking about having the plain text emails, like test that versus a more designed image-heavy one and see which one does better. Like, that's a great test to do. Using direct messaging versus indirect, a dollar discount versus a percentage. That's a good one because you can do that test and then you can do it again with different dollar amounts and different percentages and then really nail down like what works with your audience, because like maybe $10 is a discount isn't enough, but 20 is or whatever, and you can really see what resonates. You could do urgency in your messaging versus a discount. In your from name, you could do a company's name versus a person's name. Time of day, day of week, weekdays, weekends, free shipping versus discount, text links versus buttons. Like, it goes on and on. Like, there's so many things you can test, but really it just depends on what you want to learn about your subscribers. So a wise woman once told me, or said on stage at the Litmus conference a couple of years ago.
So when you're testing, if you're right, yay, you win, you got it. If you're wrong, it's okay, because you actually learned something. You learned that your own perceptions of what you thought was right was incorrect, and that way you can like make yourself know so much more. Because if you learn things that are wrong, you're like, oh, I'm wrong about that. What else am I wrong about? I need to do more testing so I can be this like walking amazing knowledge base.
Yeah, and I love this because like I know for a while, and I know I've said it here on this stage in previous years, is a cool thing about testing is when you have an argument about your boss about something stupid that they want to do, you can say, oh, let's test it, and then see if they were right or not. And I like being right. I don't know if you guys know that about me. But, and so like, even when I was a kid and my mom would be like, well, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I'm like, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, I need to be both. So yeah, I think this is great. And like, yeah, it sucks when the thing that you think was going to win doesn't win, but you still learned, oh wow, okay, let's test it further. Let's figure out what does work or why this worked.
And also being able to handle when you're wrong with grace is super important, and actually will make the people who actually make a lot of calls, people who are above you, management, that kind of thing, respect you more when you have the maturity to say, hey, I thought that this was going to be right for this reason. Turns out something completely different happened. Let's dig more into that, instead of being like, oh, I thought it was going to be right, but it turns out that this test didn't work, so that means that there's something wrong with the test. Clearly.
Yeah, like, be the bigger person. It's better. All right, so you ran your test, you have a winner. Now what? What do you do with that, Amanda?
Okay, so basically everyone says, okay, I ran a test, I know which side is best. So, question, what do you do with the losing side? Do you just give them what the winning side was just because?
It's like, oh, this side didn't work, great, let's do it. No.
So first we're gonna start with a really basic rule of thumb, which is if you run a test, and both sides perform worse than your control, don't do either one of them, but make sure that you write down whatever it is that happened. So basically, you should always have a control. It's a big thing. Don't test on your entire audience. Kristen will actually go into why later, because you never know when your results are a fluke, and you need to know what would happen if you hadn't tested anything. If you just ran whatever, like if you're testing subject line lengths, test whatever you would normally do, then test the short one and the long one. But if you have a control, if both sides suck a lot, go ahead. You might need to retest it a couple of times to make sure that, you know, everyone does really hate really short and really long subject lines. And then just go ahead and table that and keep it in an Excel doc somewhere so that you know that you have it. In case somebody, especially in case somebody brings it up again and says, why don't we test that thing that we did like 4 years ago and we don't do anymore? And it's because it failed initially. So, but this is basically kind of testing 102 is what you do with the results. So first thing, if you're running a binary test, so when I say binary test, what I mean is that the answer for the test is either yes or no. So if you're talking about, specifically for this example, is does your audience like emojis in their subject lines? Usually people are just trying to figure out, should I open this Pandora's box of emojis or not? So if you run your test, you find your result, and you're just going to go with the one that wins. In this case, 60% of your audience, super happy. Great. They love emojis. They think they're fun. But the other 40%, they're really unhappy because maybe emojis don't show up on their phone, or maybe they just have no sense of humor. I have no idea, but...
Or maybe they saw the Emoji Movie and just had a really bad experience.
That actually, yeah. So in this case, right now, you're only actually giving 60% of your users what they want. It is the majority of users, which is way better than not giving anybody what they want. And if you went ahead and didn't use emojis at all, then you would be giving only 40% what they want. So, okay, step one, you can go with emojis and you'll be getting more than half. But if you actually segment your users, so you go ahead, figure out the characteristics of the people who liked the emojis, send them emojis, and then send the other people, subjects without emojis, you're actually giving 100% of people what they want.
Yay.
Which actually goes ahead and can increase your conversion rate. Another example of this, which is a little bit more complicated, is if you're running an open-ended test. So in that case, if we're doing something like send time, if you go ahead and you take your result that wins and you use it for everybody, you have the people who really like emails at 7 p.m. and they open them and that's great. They're very happy. The rest of the people, maybe they work really late, or they're giving their kids dinner at that time, or maybe they're asleep, or they work swing shift, or whatever. Those people actually aren't getting an optimal send time. There are actually, specifically with send time, I know that there are vendors that go ahead and do dynamic send time so that everybody gets the exact right send time for them. That's really great. I'm just using this as an example because it's really easy to talk about. But what you can go ahead and actually do is find your result for that group of people who really like getting them at 7 p.m., and then going ahead and continuing to test on the group that didn't like to get it at 7 p.m. So in that case, you'll find out that there's a big block that likes 7 p.m., but there is a somewhat smaller block that really likes getting them at 3 p.m. So you go ahead and segment out that block. And if the people that are remaining is a large enough group, you can continue testing. Usually I go ahead and stop this segmentation at about 10% because otherwise it gets way too fragmented and you're having to do like 18 billion segmentations to send one email at like 11:16 at night. That's insanity, and we're not going to go there. But you can go ahead, get it down so that you have chunks up to about 10%, and then the remainder of people, I just usually lump them in with the people who liked the largest group. And if you're not quite sure how to model your users in the future to figure out what they should go ahead and when they should get emails, you can actually set up a cadence. So you say, we're going to try sending it at 7. The next time they get an email, we're going to try sending it at 3. And then when they open, you can go ahead and stick them into their future segment. So the reason that all matters is because if you did the first one, you would be reaching 55% of your group when they actually want to be reached. If you go ahead and actually go through and continue testing it, you can actually optimize 80% of the things that you send out. And that's really huge. That is an absolutely enormous amount of optimization. So,
it's more work, but it's worth it.
Whoop, I went backwards, sorry. So when I was talking earlier about flukes and why you need a control and all those things, I said Kristen was gonna actually give us a really great example, so, ta-da.
Thanks. So the great thing about testing concepts is you can repeat them multiple times, and you absolutely should because you don't know if it's going to be a fluke. So pop quiz. This is an email I got from Banana Republic on February 27th, 2015 at 6:48 a.m. So the subject line was dress and color. And no matter how this email performed, they'd probably have to throw away the results if this was part of a test. I don't work at Banana Republic. I don't know if it was a test or not. Anyone have any guesses for why this would be completely inconclusive? Here's a hint. It has to do with when it was sent. Anyone? Oh, good. We stumped them. So February 26th, 2015, the entire internet was flipping out about a dress that, depending on your screen, your color scheme on your screen, for some people it looked orange and gold, and some people it looked black and blue, and it went viral in a very big way on Twitter and on BuzzFeed and just everywhere. People were flipping out about it, and that morning, New York Times wrote an article about the science behind why people were seeing it differently. I saw it as gold and orange, even though it turns out it really was black and blue. But yeah, so because of that though, Banana sending an email the morning after everyone's obsessing over that says dress in color on the subject line, I'm sure they had an insane open rate on it, no matter what they were testing. And the email itself, it has a 40% off discount and then a picture of a dress. It was a pretty standard Banana Republic email, but it probably had insane open rates. So if they had been doing a test, they would definitely need to compare it to their controlled group to be to see if it was a fluke or not, but then also they would probably want to test this concept again to make sure that it wasn't because of what was going on in pop culture that day. So when you're doing a test, you may think you have a winner, but you could be wrong. So test the concept again a lot, as many times as you can. And some concepts are a lot easier to test repeatedly than others. If you're testing something that involves the content of your email or the design, it might be a lot more of a lift to test. But subject lines, pre-header text, send time, those are pretty low lift to test, and they can have a pretty high impact. So as you're designing your test, think about something that is repeatable so that you can really get good information about it. What I like to do with them is when I do a test, I export all of the results from all of my email sends, maybe I do it once a month, in a spreadsheet. So I get the spreadsheet from my ESP that has the send time and open click-through rates, all of that. Then I add a bunch of other columns to it, was this an A/B test? Was this version A or B? Which concept was I testing? And then I do a whole bunch of crazy pivot tables with it so I can, if I've tested send time a bunch of times and in my spreadsheet it says early or late, I can then do a pivot table to say, okay, the average early open rate is this after I've done this test 20 times. The average late open rate was this, so that gives me a lot more concrete information, and by doing it more times, I get more useful data around it. So Amanda's gonna close it with kind of a bummer, but also an opportunity for all of us.
So we're gonna talk about blog posts that feature some sort of concept that says, we're gonna tell you the best, insert thing here. Subject line, send time, anything. Specifically with email marketing, type of template, anything like that.
These posts come out all the time from ESPs sometimes.
I have seen them from ESPs, from literally anyone who has ever heard the word email or marketing, I have seen these. So here's the thing. If it's not an industry best practice, and we all know what the industry best practices are, having some form of responsive email, whether it's hybrid or spongy or whatever you want it to be, having something that looks better on mobile, that's an industry best practice. Having alt text on your images is an industry best practice. Those are things that are all very sort of tried and true, and we all know them.
You don't need to test those.
No.
Unless you want to, you could.
But if it's not that, any blog post that says that they can tell you the best whatever it is, they don't actually know what's best. What they know is they know what's best for their audience. If the blog doesn't actually say in it, here are the best subject lines for small yoga studios that cater to alpine sheep herders that live in Switzerland, then you don't know whether or not their subjects are actually going to work for you. You always need to question the results, because something like what works for my company, which is a healthcare system that we're only reaching out to members specifically about their healthcare, is very different than what Kristen is doing when she's reaching out to, let's say, doing cookie sales or to troop leaders. Her best open rate is at...
My best time, we've tested it a bunch of times. For us, for our audience, 7 p.m. really works for us because our audience is mostly parents who are probably like ready to check emails after dinner and later. But for Amanda's audience,
most of the email addresses that we have are people's work emails because they have their insurance through their work. So we need to send either between 10 and noon or between 1:30 and 3 p.m. because otherwise they just tend not to open the email as much. And that means that if Kristen wrote an amazing article that said that she has the best send time or best open time.
I do write amazing articles.
You do write amazing articles. But if you actually went ahead and said that you know the best send time for everyone, that one wouldn't be amazing.
No, it wouldn't.
But it wouldn't be applicable to my audience. And if you just take it at face value, you could end up actually digging yourself into a hole that you don't even know that you're in. So because of that, everything that you know could be wrong. It depends on where you get your information. But there's good news.
That's why you test.
So if we have time, we're open for questions. And yeah.
And there'll be a Pyrrhic night, by the way.
Hi, I'm Michelle from Hot Chalk. How do you avoid getting to the point where you're breaking your list into 100 different fragments because you've tested, and then you were talking about segmenting down. You get to the point where you're sending emails and you've just segmented yourself into sending like 15 different versions of your email every time.
Right. So usually what I go ahead and do for that is if something is a win, but it's not a huge lift, I actually go ahead and catalog it, but I don't actually implement it. And the reason that I go ahead and do that is because in my experience through doing this for a decade, but really heavily sending and testing for about 6 years, if you have a very small lift, you're never quite sure whether or not it's because you actually have that small lift or if it's because of environmental factors. So if it's usually less than like 2%, I go ahead and I just like say this is something I should test again later, but I usually don't implement it. But the other thing that I go ahead and do is I make sure that when I'm segmenting out that audience, I don't go below 10% of the actual audience itself. So if we're talking about send time, you will find that a majority of people, whoever your audience is, like a specific send time. And usually there will be 2 or 3 more biggish segments, but once you get below that like 10 to 15% threshold at the end, it's all going to be just very scattershot. I really do find that the 80-20 rule that everybody talks about is actually it's very true. So usually 80% of your users will fall into a couple of buckets, and then those 20% are just going to be all over the place. And so usually I just give them the bucket that performs best, and I hope.
Yeah, I think something else to think about that too, because like that takes a lot of time, like especially if you're manually like segmenting and like creating that many different versions of the email. So at that point, if you might need to look at the numbers again and think, okay, is the lift, the minuscule lift that I might get by having 7 different sends worth it for the number of hours I'm spending to do that? So you really have to balance that out, and it might be, but it might not. So yeah, you really want to look at all of your conversion rates and everything to see what's helping you.
Yeah, if you find out that whatever it is that you're testing, when you're breaking it into segments, if it's a really huge lift, like if you get this right, they will convert and you will have a customer for life and they will never unsubscribe.
Might be worth it.
It might actually be worth it to go down to like 5% or something like that. But generally, whatever we're doing is not going to raise things by that much that it's worth getting into the individual customization. And if you do end up in that place, there are vendors who go ahead and have solutions that can go ahead and do all the crazy, like, everybody gets a personalized email.
Some of them are here, and we're sponsors at events last night.
Yeah. The one thing I will say, though, is that if you do go that route, remember that it makes it much harder to test other things in the future because your control is all different. So that's the one big thing, is that if all of your messages are personalized, remember that your control is not actually stable. It's very varied. So.
Hey, let's give it up for Kristen and Amanda. Wow. Thanks very much.